Good day. Today, like with my two previous videos, I'm going to concentrate in this video on the situation in Ukraine, though I will touch on the other two big stories of today, the summit meeting between President Biden of the United States and President Xi Jinping in San Francisco. Indeed, shortly before I started making this video, pictures appeared of President Xi Jinping arriving in the United States, and also, of course, the ongoing crisis in the Middle East. But let's first of all turn to the situation in Ukraine. Yesterday, I spent a great deal of time discussing the various rumors and speculations and stories about a political crisis in Kiev, the clear signs that some kind of a power struggle is underway between the civilian leadership concentrated around President Zelensky and the military leadership of the Ukrainian armed forces, whose leader, or at least nominal leader, is General Zaluzhny. And of course, we have had many reports that the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, William Burns, is arriving in Kiev today, and his job, no doubt, will be to sort out this mess, or at least to try to direct events in a particular direction. I spent a huge amount of time going through all the various rumors yesterday in my program. I'm going to leave those for the moment. Suffice to say that it seems all the indications are that the crisis continues unabated, the political crisis continues unabated. But I'm going to talk instead about the military situation, which is turning, or so seems to me, from bad to disastrous for Ukraine across all of the battlefronts, and which promises at some point in the not too remote future to go from disastrous, merely disastrous, to outright catastrophic. Anyway, let us quickly deal with the situation in the secondary battlefronts. I say the secondary battlefronts, though it is important to stress that the Russian Defense Ministry is now reporting a major increase in Ukrainian casualties, and these aren't just concentrated in one place. They seem to be taking place now all across the battlefronts. Back in the summer, the late summer, early autumn, I was pointing out that even as fighting continued in Zaporozhye and on the Vremovka salient and around Kupiansk near the Oskol River, Russian Ministry of Defense estimates suggested that the bulk of the fighting, as indicated by its claimed casualty rate for Ukrainian soldiers, the worst, the most intense fighting was in Bakhmut, in and around Bakhmut, where the Ukrainians were making what, as it turned out, was an unsuccessful attempt to reverse the gains and capture of Bakhmut that the Russians had achieved earlier this year. Well, that is no longer quite the case anymore. Fighting in and around Bakhmut remains extremely intense, though the initiative has now passed to the Russians. But it's clear that as Ukrainian casualties are growing, they are now heavy on every battlefront, every part of the front lines in Ukraine. We now see reports of Ukrainian soldiers being killed and wounded in the Russian Ministry of Defense briefings. Now, let me repeat again a point which I have made in previous times. I do not vouch for the precise accuracy of these Ministry of Defense briefings. The Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, said that they're based, to some extent at least, on radio intercept evidence, and no doubt the Russians have other means to track Ukrainian casualties. Overall, I get the sense that they're probably not far off from the correct figures, but this is a vexed and controversial subject, one which I'm not going to discuss further in this program. My simple point is that the increases in the casualty numbers that we've been starting to see for some time now reflect an overall trend, and that points to the intensity of the fighting and to the damage upon the Ukrainians that the Russians believe that they are causing, and on the evidence of the situation on the ground, they probably have good grounds for that belief. Now, I mentioned Bakhmut and I mentioned Kupiansk, and perhaps it's useful to start with these two places. And as I said, in and around Bakhmut, the initiative has now moved back to the Russians. And interestingly enough, the main focus of the Russian advance is on the northern flank of Bakhmut, where the Russians appear to have recovered nearly all the ground that they gave up to the Ukrainians following the Ukrainian counterattacks, which began in this area on the 10th of May, before the rest of Ukraine's offensive got underway. And that is starting to put Russian forces once more within proximate distance of the village of Khromovo. Now, Khromovo is to the northwest of Bakhmut. During the winter and spring fighting, the Wagner organization forces came very close indeed to Khromovo. It looked for a time as if they might capture it, but then they withdrew their forces from the area and concentrated on finishing off Ukrainian resistance within Bakhmut itself. And the Russian troops who replaced them in this area were fewer in number and perhaps less skilled, and gradually they withdrew from the area close to Khromovo as they took up defensive positions further east. Well, it looks as if the Russians, well, perhaps they're not quite as close to Khromovo as the Wagner organization got, but they're getting closer once more. Now, if Khromovo is taken, if the Russians do attack and capture Khromovo, and I understand it's a relatively small place, then all sorts of things in the Bakhmut area start to become possible. And firstly, the Russians might be able to capture the next big village further to the west. I believe it's called Blagodatnoye, but I'm not absolutely sure, and others can correct me. If that particular village is captured, Khromovo and that other particular village are captured, then, so it seems to me, the Russian position in Bakhmut becomes fully consolidated, and it will be much more difficult at any notional, hypothetical future time for the Ukrainians to mount any kind of serious offensive in this area with any kind of prospect of success being measured by a serious effort to retake or perhaps re-enter Bakhmut itself. So that would be an important development. But of course, if the Russians were to be able to capture these two villages, other things also start to become possible, because to the southwest of Bakhmut there is another village. The Russians call it Krasnoye, the Ukrainians call it Ivanivska. It lies to the west of Kleshayevka, which the Russians are now apparently also seeking to recapture. There are reports today and yesterday that Russian infantry are trying to scale the heights around Kleshayevka, which the Ukrainians apparently were able to capture at some point over the course of their counterattack in this area. If they do recapture these heights, then it seems that the Russians will be able to push the Ukrainians completely out of Kleshevka and consolidate control of Kleshevka as well, effectively entirely reversing all Ukrainian gains around Bakhmut since the 10th of May. But anyway, Ivaniska lies to the northwest of Kleshevka, but it could also, notionally at least, be threatened by Russian forces in this other village, if the Russians ever were to capture this other village. Let's call it Blagodatnoye. I'm not absolutely sure that that is its correct name. If they do capture this village, if they capture Ivaniska, then not only do the Russians, also it seems to me, fully consolidate their positions in Bakhmut, ending any serious possibility of a Ukrainian offensive in this area, but they are positioned to advance further west towards the town of Chasov Yar. And by the way, pictures have recently appeared of Chasov Yar, showing the place utterly devastated. I remember at the time of the fighting around Bakhmut, early in the spring, a Western journalist visited Chasov Yar. At that time, the fighting was still underway in Bakhmut itself, but this person, this journalist, I think he was from the Daily Telegraph, described Chasov Yar, and my impression was that at that time, the town was still largely intact, though a Ukrainian soldier told him that it was undefendable in the event that there was a serious Russian attempt to seize Chasov Yar. But anyway, it doesn't seem as if it is intact anymore. Clearly, there's been massive shelling and bombing by the Russian army and air force in this area. So, could notionally advance towards Chasov Yar. If Chasov Yar and Orekhovo, Vasilyevka further north, also part of this area, are captured by the Russians, then the Ukrainian defenses in this whole area start to look extremely fragile, and a possible further Russian advance towards Konstantinovka, further west still, and then Kramatorsk begins to become possible. Now, I don't know that these are the Russian plans, but it is something that the Ukrainians themselves must be worried about. It's why they've been so focused first on defending Bakhmut and then on trying to recapture it, because it does open the way to these places. Control of Bakhmut does open the way to these places. So if an operational crisis starts to develop there, then the situation becomes as critical for the Ukrainians in the Bakhmut area as it arguably is further north around Kupiansk, where the Russians continue their advances. We get extremely vague reports about what exactly is going on. But anyway, the general trend of reports still speak of steady, incremental, methodical Russian advances. So a potential crisis for the Ukrainians there. And of course, an indisputable crisis for the Ukrainians further south in Avdeyevka, where the situation over the last 24, 36 hours for the Ukrainians appears to have deteriorated still further. Now, I've discussed how the Russians have apparently managed to cross the railway line northwest of Avdeyevka. The railway line itself, it should be said, is no longer has stopped being for some time a means of transportation. It was apparently working. The Ukrainians were sending trains into Avdeyevka until a couple of months ago, but with the intensity of the fighting around Avdeyevka, the Ukrainians have stopped trying to use this railway for some time. To the extent that Ukrainian troops get resupplied in Avdeyevka, they're being resupplied by road. But we will come to all of that in a moment. But the railway line, as we will see in more detail shortly, was an important defensive barrier because it's on a kind of artificial embankment, and the Russians have crossed it, and they have armoured vehicles moving west of the railway line. And over the last couple of hours, the Russians, and now this appears to be confirmed by pretty much every serious and reliable Russian telegram channel, Slavyangrad, again, has all of this set out in more detail than I'm going to do. But pretty much every important Russian telegram channel now confirms that the Russians have also pushed the Ukrainian troops out of the contested village of Stepovoye. Now, the Russians haven't occupied this village, or so it seems. The village has been destroyed, and again, there's a certain absence of cover for the Russian forces in this particular village, or for the Ukrainian forces for that matter, so it is in the grey zone. But nonetheless, the Russians appear to have pushed the Ukrainians out of the village. They're continuing to make gains around the village. They're capturing tree lines and things of that kind. If you want the details, you can go either to Slavyangrad or to the military summary channel. They provide an absolutely detailed picture of the fighting in this area. And it seems that the Russians are making big advances there as well. And the Russians are also advancing much closer to Avdeyevka itself, further east, which is a bit further east from these locations. There's reports that the Russians are pushing hard into the industrial buildings to the northeast of Avdeyevka, but also that they have captured a significant part of the industrial zone to the south of Avdeyevka as well. And there is a most revealing film, or rather I should say two films, one from a Ukrainian source, one from a Russian source, of a Russian tank now trundling through a shattered landscape. And from what I can understand, this particular Russian tank is operating on the suburban residential buildings of Avdeyevka itself, somewhere to the southwest. If you want to see that film, again, the Military Summary Channel, those two films, the Military Summary Channel shows them. And of course, the point made there by Dima is that there is no sign of any Ukrainian opposition. There's no artillery fire on this tank. There's no attempts to strike this tank with anti-tank guided missiles or rocket-propelled anti-tank grenades. There is an attempt to strike at this tank with an FPV drone. I'm not sure whether a drone like that can do a huge amount of damage to a tank of this kind, but the engineers amongst you and the military people can probably determine that for yourselves. But the fact is, the overall fact is that this tank is able to trundle around and is able to do so without meeting much in the way of opposition. And interestingly enough, this tank trundling around in this area of what appears to be Avdeyevka itself, the film of it, there's two films. One is Ukrainian. That's the film that shows the FPV drone hitting the tank. The other is Russian. And the fact that the Russians have made a film of the same incident suggests to me that despite the flash and bang and the smoke, the tank itself probably survived the attack by the FPV drone. Anyway, that's my guess. I'm not, as I said, the best person at analysing photographs and films. So, a situation where Avdeyevka, the defences of Avdeyevka are coming under intense pressure and look like they're starting to crumble. And I saw that Dima at the Military Summary channel made what for me personally was an absolutely astonishing assertion. I must assume that he's correct, which is that the defences around Avdeyevka, and indeed in this area in the northeast area of Bakhmut near Berkhovka, where the Russians are making their big advances at the moment, that the actual outer defence lines are very heavily fortified indeed, but that if the Russians are able to break through this outer ring of fortifications, there are no further fortifications behind them. Now that does, I have to say, astonish me. It is completely different from what the Russians did when they built up the Surovikin line back, well, over the course of this year and starting last year. If you see maps and images of the Surovikin line, you will find that the defences are incredibly densely layered. You know, beyond one line, there's another line, there's lots of lines of trenches and pillboxes and minefields, one behind the other. There's careful structuring of the defence lines to create fire sacks. There's a really interesting article from the Royal United Services Institute in Britain, which discusses all of these things. These are incredibly densely layered and complex fortifications. If what Dima is saying on the Military Summary channel is true, and I am sure it is, I mean, I have no reason to doubt this, then the Ukrainian defences near Bakhmut, but perhaps more specifically around Avdeyevka itself, seem primitive by comparison. And though they're extremely difficult to break through in a frontal assault, it looks like whoever designed them never took into account the possibility of a Russian envelopment. And that, no doubt, goes far to explain the assessment that I also read some time ago in Slavyangrad, that if Avdeyevka falls, all of the other big Ukrainian defense points, Vugleda, Marinka, all of those, they start all to tumble one after the other like nine pins, because the Russians can then get between them all, interfere in the communications, the Ukrainian communications, and there are no real fortified barriers that would slow the Russian armour down. Now, all of this, everything that I have described up to this point, comes from Russian sources, or, if you prefer, Dima, by the way, at the Military Summary channel, I understand he's not Russian, and many of the people who write on Slavyangrad are not Russians. But anyway, if you prefer pro-Russian sources. But we now have, or I should more correctly say, we have had for several days, I've only just become aware of it, a long article in the Spanish newspaper El Pais. It is dated 13th November, and it is by a journalist, a Spanish journalist, a Christian Segura, who has obviously visited the front lines or come close to the front lines, though he has not visited Avdeyevka itself. I think it's important to say this. Anyway, he paints an absolutely catastrophic picture of the situation in Avdeyevka, and one which so far as I can see, entirely corroborates all that we've been hearing from all these various Russian or pro-Russian sources, which I have been talking about. And what it also shows, by the way, is something else, which is that the Russians are not only now have the offensive, the initiative in this war, but they're achieving psychological dominance over the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian soldiers who are fighting them, even Western trained Ukrainian soldiers, seem to be in awe of the Russians. And in order to demonstrate that, I'm going to read extensively from this article. It is not, as far as I know, behind a paywall. So the article begins with the title, Under Siege on the Ukrainian Front Line of Avdeyevka. And then there's a quote. Russians are more prepared for war and to die. Now that sounds, in some ways, an interesting thing to say. I mean, it might be taken as a sign that lots and lots of Russians are dying, and we will see that that is indeed the claim that is made later on in the article. But it comes with what for the Ukrainians and their Western backers is a very disturbing twist. And then there's the subtitle, Moscow's air and artillery superiority is pushing the defenders of the strategic city in Donetsk province to the limit as ammunition supplies run low. And then there is a long discussion. There's the usual introductory pieces, the impressionistic pieces, and this journalist was originally based with a Ukrainian artillery unit close to a village called Ocheretine, which is around some distance from Avdeyevka, and he discusses the situation as of last Friday, so it's some days old now, and he starts with a discussion about how the Ukrainian guns were firing in the direction of Avdeyevka. The article also mentions the fact that there's been heavy fog. It starts by mentioning the fact that there's been heavy fog, and this has been commented on by both sides about this battle. And the general consensus is that both in terms of the fighting in Avdeyevka itself and in terms of the fighting along the Dnieper River line in Kherson region, which I will come to later, the fog has worked to the advantage of the Ukrainians. It's been more helpful to the Ukrainians than it has been to the Russians. But then we have an interview with a Ukrainian soldier who is mentioned, who's called Ivan, and he is a soldier in an assault company of the 47th Mechanized Brigade. And the article tells us that this is one of the Ukrainian units set up with NATO weapons and training. And in fact, it is the heaviest, most powerful brigade that the West created. It is the one which has the Bradleys and the Leopard 2s, or did, and whose troops were trained principally in Germany to operate these systems. And then we're told that Ivan and his men are defending the railroad tracks on the northern flank of Avdeyevka. Now, this is the railway line that I was talking about. And the article goes on to say the rail line is elevated. It is on an embankment, serving as a retaining wall against advancing armor, and from it, infantry movement can also be slowed. And then Ivan tells us about the seriousness, the importance of this railway line, of this defense line that the Ukrainians had created along this railway line. He says, if the Russians take control of the tracks, it will be a disaster. And the article goes on to say, by disaster, this officer means that the Russians, by dominating the roads, can ensure the advance of their troops to surround Avdeyevka from the north. The Russian assault is focused on the vicinity of the city's coke factory, the largest production plant for this kind of fuel in Europe. The problem is that the enemy, he means the Russians, has already punched through a 2-mile stretch of the railway line. They don't have control. In a single day, we can take and lose positions there 3 times. We are fighting at 30 meters. This is from Ivan. They keep coming in platoons of 10 to 15 men. They are constantly attacking us. Now, since then, and this describes the situation as of last Friday, we know that the situation has indeed got much worse. The Russians not only have already punched through a 2-mile stretch of the railway line, they have expanded their control in this area, and they've moved further west, and they've been able to push the Ukrainians out of Stepovoye. And in fact, I understand that there are reports now that Russian armor has indeed crossed the railway line. Then the article goes on to say, Russian casualties are innumerable, says Ivan, but on the Ukrainian side, they are also very high. He himself has lost his entire platoon of 17 men, either dead or captured. Now, let's put aside the question of Russian casualties. The Ukrainians come up with all kinds of figures for the enormous casualties that the Russians are supposed to be experiencing. As I've said before, the study of Russian casualties, of Russian fatalities in this war, published by Mediazona in partnership with the BBC, doesn't actually support these Ukrainian claims. But note that Ivan is telling us that his own platoon of 17 men, they're all either dead or captured. He appears to be the lone survivor. And the article goes on to say the bulk of the 47th Mechanized Brigade was transferred to Avdeyevka in mid-October, when the current Russian offensive to take the city began. Ivan and his men had earlier participated in the failed Ukrainian summer counteroffensive on the Zaporozhye front. The 47th Brigade suffered heavily in the first 3 months of the offensive, when Kiev opted for a strategy of assaults with large armoured columns. Russian fortified defences and minefields slowed the advance, and enemy artillery and drones easily destroyed vehicles and troops. And then the article goes on to say that military sources on the Zaporozhye front assured this newspaper last September that the 47th Brigade lost more than 30% of its strength in that battle, around 22,000 of its 5,000 soldiers. Ivan claims he saw 16 of his comrades die. And then he goes on to say, but it's worse emotionally in Avdeyevka, because defending is harder on morale than attacking. You have to pray, sheltered in the trench for 4 days, the time the rotations last, that their artillery doesn't kill you, and then resist assault after assault by their infantry. And then we get to the point about the Russians achieving psychological dominance over the Ukrainians. And These are the sort of comments, the kind of comments we're going to see now from this article, explain why I talk about psychological dominance. Because we go on to read, Russian casualties in the siege of Avdeyevka are counted in hundreds of armoured vehicles and thousands of human lives. As I said, we've had no independent corroboration of this, and so far, up to this point, the media Zona reports don't really corroborate those claims. And we go on to read, Ukrainian military propaganda accounts, interesting that El Pais, Spanish newspaper, talks about Ukrainian military propaganda. Sharp contrast to what you tend to see, for example, in the British media, where Ukrainian reports tend to be accepted as factual truth. But anyway, Ukrainian military propaganda accounts on social networks have shared numerous videos of the destruction caused to the invading forces, especially by the cluster munitions provided by the United States. But Ivan shakes his head in disapproval. Apart from the training of their troops, he says, the Russians are superior in every way, and they have resources to spare. If they take the railroad tracks, they will send the armour again. And if 10 vehicles come out from their second line, our artillery will hit them, yes, but 4 will get through and reach their destination. Ivan underlines the main difference between the Ukrainian and Russian armies in Zaporozhye. His squadron, now he's talking about the Ukrainian offensive in Zaporozhye. His squadron surrounded a Russian position defended by professional soldiers from a Russian airborne division. The opposing force eventually ran out of ammunition and were repeatedly urged to surrender. Instead, the Russians blew themselves up with grenades. I don't know any Ukrainians who have done this. They, meaning the Russians, have a different conception of life. Russians are more prepared for war and to die. Now, I don't know to what extent this is true. This might have been an isolated incident. It might have been an incident where Ivan misunderstood what happened. But you can see how he talks about the Russians being willing to fight, either to win or die, and he all but admits that Ukrainians are not prepared to do the same thing. And then we have more comments about this and about how the Russians fight like zombies in the war, and the fact that the Ukrainians have to shelter, take cover in underground vehicle shelters and pickup vehicles. And then we go on to read Seth, the code name of an infantry company commander. This is, again, another Ukrainian officer. Corroborates what experts and other officers consulted on the Avdeyevka front indicate. One of the biggest changes in the war has been Moscow's leap forward in drone technology and production. Russian air superiority over the defending army is overwhelming, military officers say. Ukrainian military officers say. The most cited models are the same. Orlan reconnaissance drones observe everything from 3 kilometers above ground. They identify a target and within minutes, Lancet bomb drones, in other words, kamikaze drones, arrive. Seth also stresses that they have seen an increase in enemy Zoopark, these are anti-artillery, counter-artillery radars, which detect the coordinates of artillery positions from their sound waves. And then Seth refers to the Russian artillery as zombies because they advance even in the face of almost certain death. As far as he has been able to ascertain, enemy troops do not retreat on pain of being executed by order of their superiors. US intelligence services stated in October that they are certain the order of the Russian High Command are to shoot soldiers who retreat during an attack. There's no evidence of this. This is absolutely not the case. But again, one senses the awe and the fear of not just of this vast drone armada that the Russians now have, the domination of the air, but the fact that the Russian infantry advances and strikes are relentless. And then we have another officer, somebody called Alexander, who commands a unit of US Paladin self-propelled guns, which also belong, by the way, to the 47th Brigade. And he says it's like in Bakhmut, they advance madly like zombies because they want to take Avdeyevka, whatever it takes. And as in Bakhmut, there have been days in Avdeyevka when there have been up to 300 drones in the sky. And then he talks about critical problems with ammunition. If in Bakhmut in April and in summer in Orechov on the Zaporozhye front, that is to say in the area of the Rabotino-Verbovoye attacks, if in Bakhmut in April and in summer in Orechov on the Zaporozhye front, Alexander's unit fired between 100 and 150 shells a day. In Avdiivka, they're only able to fire 15. According to Alexander, the guns also lose accuracy from being used so much. In summer, his Paladin had a margin of error of 7 meters over the target. Now it's 70 meters. Now, this, again, has been spoken about by many people. In terms of ammunition shortages, Ukraine's ammunition shortages, the inability of the West to keep Ukraine supplied with the ammunition it needs. Well, I've discussed it, Brian Beletic has discussed it, Alex Vashinin discussed it, many other people have discussed it, and we now see the catastrophic results of this. The comment about the fact that the artillery guns are becoming worn down is not something I know very much about myself, but it's been explained very clearly by Jim Kinnair in his various books about artillery and weapon systems, artillery systems, Soviet artillery systems. And of course, it's also been discussed by Brian Beletic and, to my knowledge, many others. Scott Ritter has spoken about it as well. Western guns, in some cases, because of their higher pressures, require more maintenance and more barrel changes than Ukrainian guns and than Western guns. And the Western guns that Ukraine has been supplied with cannot receive that level of maintenance or the necessary numbers of barrel changes because of the overwhelming logistical difficulties. And we can see how this is starting to have an effect. Anyway, the article then goes on to discuss the artillery crisis overall, and it goes on to say that Kiev's NATO allies have practically run out of ammunition reserves, and Western military industry will not be able to fully arm their own countries and Ukraine until the end of 2024, according to the estimates of Zaluzhny and US and European defense analysts. It's problematic, by the way, whether the situation is going to get any better by them either. And anyway, critical ammunition shortages. And by the way, the Russians have picked up on this We have comments that are now starting to appear in the Russian media as well. The Russian news agency TASS quotes Abdi Alaudinov, who is the commander of the Chechen forces, the overall commander of the Chechen forces, fighting with the Russians in the zone of the special military operation. Alaudinov also says that the Russians have noticed a steep reduction in the rate of fire of the Ukrainian artillery over the last few weeks. And this article, as I said, from Pais, appears to confirm that that is indeed the case. But it's not just drones and artillery and armored vehicles and numbers where the Russians have the advantage. We have another interview with another Ukrainian officer or non-commissioned officer, Roman, who commands a mortar unit of the Ukrainian 110th Separate Brigade, and we learn that it's trenches as well. The Russians have the advantage in trench warfare also. And he says the Russians are way ahead of us in trench engineering. And Ivan, or the soldier we heard from before, he also agrees. He says that the Russians advance 300 or 500 meters and then dig, advance 300 meters and dig again. Their trenches are deeper and more secure than ours. They gain ground and secure it. When we take one of their positions, we are happy because we are more secure in our trenches than in ours. And then going back to Roman, he points out that the Russian ability to dig trenches is due to not having sufficient ammunition, Ukrainians not having sufficient ammunition to prevent it. According to his calculations, if at the beginning of the war his mortars could fire one shell for every enemy shell, now the difference is 1 to 8. We can't operate for long either because of the constant airstrikes, Roman also tells us. And by the way, this is the first admission that we have had that the Russian Air Force is also playing an active role in Avdeyevka, which it is, by the way. The Russians have been bombing Ukrainian positions continuously in the Avdeyevka area, and that undoubtedly is having its effect also. Now, there have been all sorts of articles like this in the past, articles going back all the way to the fighting in Kherson region last autumn. I think it was an article in the New York Times. Brian Beletic has cited it several times about the immense material and technological and organizational advantages that the Russians have over the Ukrainians and the enormous losses the Ukrainians are absorbing. There were similar articles during the Battle of Bakhmut about the Ukrainians being massively outgunned by a Russian military force that outmatched them massively in every department, and we can see that the situation is getting worse. The Ukrainians now face additional problems on top of the problems that they had previously. It's not just that the Russians have huge advantage, for example, in artillery. They've had that at every stage during this whole war, and it's clear that that advantage is increasing. But the Russians appear to be conclusively winning the struggle in terms of drone warfare. Their Orlan drones and their Lancet drones are incredibly active. The Russians appear to be every bit as adept at using FPV drones as the Ukrainians are, probably more so. And I'm not even discussing the strategic drones, the Geranium-2 drones, which now carry out everyday nightly strikes across Ukraine, and of which pictures have now appeared of this giant factory the Russians are building in Kherson, which is going to be able to churn out these things at a rate of apparently hundreds, perhaps thousands a month. But anyway, in terms of these tactical drones, the Russians are now achieving a decisive advantage. And we can also see that the Ukrainians are becoming awed and frightened by the Russian infantry. Let me reiterate again, there is no evidence, there's never been any evidence at any time during the war that either side has seriously engaged in human wave tactics. The closest perhaps that we got to that was in the Bakhmut fighting, when Prigozhin sent squads of barely trained convicts to support Wagner spearheads fighting within Bakhmut city itself. Though even then, if you actually analyze the way in which those convicts were used, they were not the assault forces as such, and it still didn't amount to human waves, even though the casualties amongst those convicts was enormously high, which is one of the factors, by the way, which caused the crisis in relations between Prigozhin and the Russian Ministry of Defense. But there's been nothing like that. There's no evidence either that Russian soldiers who don't advance face execution. There's no word of this. If such a practice existed, given the extraordinarily critical and vociferous nature of Russian war reporting, much of which goes out of its way to say unpleasant things about Russia's military leadership and its command forces. I have absolutely no doubt that if that was the practice, I would have heard about it. What the Ukrainians are clearly faced with is a situation where, because the Russians have superior numbers and organization, they are able to maintain attacks round the clock all the time. And that is wearing the Ukrainians down. It is exhausting and demoralizing the soldiers. And as I said, it is consolidating amongst them a sense that the Russians have this psychological ascendancy. Reading this article on El Pais, it is absolutely clear to me that the Ukrainians have no realistic chance of holding on to Avdeyevka. The soldiers are exhausted and demoralized. The Ukrainian troops there are out of shells. The Russians are advancing. They've pushed beyond the railway track that Ivan, the soldier, was telling us was so important. It's becoming increasingly difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on. And they're pulling units from every part of their front lines to try to stabilize the situation in Avdiivka. And these reinforcements are being attritioned away. Now, that is the case now, not just in one place, as it was during the Bakhmut fighting. It is the case everywhere. Now, I haven't totted up the figures myself, but I noticed that on one of my threads, one of the threads to one of my preceding videos, a commenter there mentioned that according to the Russian Defense Ministry, the Ukrainians had lost 900 men on one particular day. Now, of course, the Russian Defense Ministry has made even greater claims for Ukrainian losses on other days and on other occasions earlier in this war. But I'm getting the sense now that this is starting to become a routine thing. And it does perhaps look as if Ukrainian losses are spiking. And on the topic of the Russians suffering heavier losses than the Ukrainians, I can only come back to the observation so often and correctly made by Brian Beletic. All the other facts that we see point otherwise. We see that Ivan says that his entire platoon, for example, has been wiped out. But put things like that aside. Both during the Bakhmut fighting, when it appears that the Ukrainians had more ammunition than they do today, we've just read that the artillery unit was able to fire around 100 to 150 shells in the fighting in Bakhmut, and during the summer offensive, they're now only able to fire around 15, and the barrels are so worn down that the accuracy has declined steeply from 7 meters to around 70 meters. Anyway, putting that aside, the Russians have overwhelming superiority in artillery. This is again what this article says. It is well established, it is in fact conclusively established, that the single biggest cause of casualties in this kind of warfare is artillery fire. And it's also, by the way, been well established from casualty records that artillery fire is the single biggest cause of casualties by far in this particular war. So given that the Russians are firing so many more shells, a Ukrainian officer in this article told Pais that in terms of mortars, the Russians are now able to fire 8 mortar rounds for every one that he's able to fire. Given that that is so, how can it possibly be the case that the Ukrainians are suffering fewer losses than the Russians? Now, and we see that one of these soldiers, they seem to be a mix of officers and non-commissioned officers actually. One of these Ukrainian soldiers, Ivan, is unimpressed and unhappy with what the Pais journalist calls the Ukrainian military propaganda that is being published on Ukrainian social media. And it's not difficult to see why. All this talk of casualties, of massive Russian losses, it is not really consistent with what we're seeing in terms of the actual fighting, and it is not consistent at all with the weight of artillery fire, the aerial bombing, which this article doesn't discuss, and this vast ability that the Russians have with these huge numbers of drones, 300 drones operating over the Avdeyevka battlefield on any one day, both to observe the battlefronts, to send Lancet drones to attack Ukrainian units, and to do enormous damage. So, a battle in Avdiivka that is being lost, and it is being lost in exactly the same way that all the other battles Ukraine has fought against the Russians have been lost previously. Ukrainians fighting to defend undefendable positions, allowing their troops to come under the fire of massive Russian artillery barrages. And the death toll is becoming greater, and the conditions are becoming grimmer. But in terms of overall Ukrainian tactics, nothing appears to be changing. They continue to do the same thing, with President Zelensky still insisting that every position must be defended, and Ukrainian generals, apparently, despite their doubts, their growing doubts, unwilling or unable to go against his orders. Now, that brings me to that other place, which is the situation on the Dnieper River. There's been an enormous amount of discussion and much commentary about what is going on along the Dnieper River in Kherson region. Some people on the pro-Ukrainian side, and of course Ukrainians themselves, are talking about the Ukrainians holding the initiative in this area. And up to a certain point, I've myself done the same. I've spoken about the Ukrainians holding the initiative in this area. But I'm starting to get increasingly the sense that the Russians are now becoming increasingly confident that they've surmounted the problem. And the fact that a new commander, General Teplinsky, has been deployed to this area, no doubt has played a role. But as I've discussed before, the fact that Teplinsky was appointed is a sign that the Russian command is taking this area of the battlefronts more seriously, and that would mean that they would be prepared to commit more resources to it. And of course, Teplinsky himself has the pull with the military leadership in Rostov and the civilian leadership in Moscow, also to ensure that he gets the equipment and the supplies that he needs. Now, there's one very strong reason to think that the Russians believe that they're getting on top of the situation, because we've now had a discussion of what's happening in Krinky from a Russian official. Up to this point, the Russian officialdom has been essentially silent about what's happening in Krinky. Now, some Western media outlets, notably The Guardian, are treating this fact as the Russians finally admitting that the Ukrainians have managed to establish a bridgehead across the Dnieper. And to a certain extent that is true, except, of course, that Russian media and Russian social media have been talking about this for weeks. My own view is that the regent Saldo, and it is him indeed, the governor of Kherson region, is talking about it now, is because, as I said, the Russians are confident, are becoming confident that they're getting on top of this problem. And this is what Saldo has said, and it's quite a detailed discussion. He says about a company and a half of enemy personnel, that's about 150 men as I understand it, mostly small groups, are staying along the left bank's area from the railway bridge to Krinky. So he's putting the number of Ukrainian troops at around 150. The enemy has crossed the river by sending more personnel for some time than our firepower can destroy. To put it simply, the enemy has thrown troops in for slaughter. It has already lost at least 1.5 to 2 full-fledged battalions at the crossing and during its stay on the left bank. The average period for a Ukrainian soldier to stay on the left bank is slightly over 2 days. And then Saldo went on to say that Russia's Dnieper battle group has sealed off the Ukrainian army units that have crossed to the left bank in Krinky. The enemy has been blocked in Krinky, where it has come into a fiery hell. It is being bombarded by bombs, missiles, munitions of heavy flamethrower systems, artillery shells and drones. They are sitting in basements and running over one by one at night. Over the past 2 to 3 days, the Ukrainian military has suffered about 100 casualties. Russian forces daily capture from 2 to 13 Ukrainian soldiers in the Kherson area. The moral condition of most of Kiev's regime soldiers is extremely low. There is nothing surprising in that. They are simply sent for slaughter practically every day. New groups numbering from 2 to 3 to 11 to 13 militants, that means Ukrainian soldiers, surrender to our troops. And he says that whereas previously it was former Ukrainian elite Marine infantry that was trying to hold on to this bridgehead, it is now over 60% mobilized conscripts due to heavy casualties. Now, I think Saldo, from what I can tell, is right. I say this again because what he's reported as saying here is consistent with what other Russian channels, which I've generally considered reliable, are also reporting. The Ukrainians did manage to gain control of some houses in Krinky. They've made various attempts to enlarge their zone of control beyond that, but they haven't been at all successful. They're able to replace troops by sending boats, small boats across the river. Again, the Dnieper River, the military summary channel has provided some explanation of this. These boats apparently get into the water with their soldiers in far up tributaries of the Dnieper, like the Ingulets. They then move down these tributaries and they eventually reach the Dnieper River. They're protected to some extent by the islands, some of which the Ukrainians control, and they're able to creep up to the east bank and land their troops there. Now, this has partly been possible because of the foggy conditions, which make it more difficult for the Russian drones to keep track of what the Ukrainians are doing. But of course, this is a season of fogs. During the winter period, perhaps there will be fewer fogs, less mist. And anyway, the point is that the Ukrainian troops are not able to advance beyond these buildings, because when they do, they collide into the Russian army, into the Russian defenses, into Russian artillery and machine gun positions and all of that, and they suffer very heavy losses. And in the meantime, the Russians, for their part, continue to launch airstrikes and artillery strikes against Ukrainian positions on the west bank of the Dnieper as well. There's also been a fair number of reports that I can't corroborate, by the way, that the Russians have also themselves sent raiding parties onto the Ukrainian-controlled part, west bank of the Dnieper. What they do, how many they are, whether they're there on any regular or protracted degree of that, of course, I can't speak. Now, that is my summary of the military situation. We see a catastrophic situation starting to evolve in Avdeyevka. Western commentators have spoken of Avdeyevka as the hinge of Ukrainian defenses in southern Donbass. We see a political crisis now developing in Kiev itself, and it doesn't seem as if things are going at all well for Ukraine on the battlefronts. Quite the opposite. Now, all of this is happening even as the economic war that the West has been waging against Russia has been failing catastrophically. Firstly, yesterday there was an article in the Financial Times. Its title says it all. Almost no Russian oil is sold below the $60 cap, say Western officials. So the G7's attempts last year and early this year to place a cap on the price that the Russians could sell their oil of $60, well, that's been a complete and total failure. The Russians have been able to sell all their oil above the cap, in fact, in many cases, well above the cap. And Russian officials, by the way, are saying that the premium, rather not the premium, the discount the Russians had to give to third-party buyers to buy their oil has been reducing as the year has worn on and as business relationships have settled. The Russians are able to sell their oil closer to the market price. And we also read that the European Commission itself has now concluded that the Russian economy is going to grow quite rapidly this year. It says it now projects growth of 2% instead of a contraction of 0.9% expected earlier. And the European Commission predicts that the Russian economy will grow by 1.6% in each of 2024 and 2025. So from a contraction of 0.9%, they think it will now grow by 2%. Of course, about that, they've perhaps been overtaken by events. Russian officials, the Russian Finance Minister Anton Siluanov, he says that he expects growth this year to be closer to 3% than 2%. And it could be that these other estimates of 1.6% growth in 2024 and 2025 will be too low also. After all, we've just had this whopping revision from 0.9% contraction to 2% growth. And then the European Commission goes on to say that Russia succeeded in diverting a large share of its exports, especially commodities, to willing buyers, notably China and India. And they then acknowledge that there are inflationary pressures in Russia in 2023, but they say that it will decline. They say consumer inflation is projected to reach 6% in 2023. That might actually be an underestimate, but they go on to say that tight monetary policy and a slowing economy are expected to bring inflation down in the coming years to 4.6% in 2024 and 4% in 2025. And that might be correct. They're taking that information, by the way, largely from the Russian central bank. So, Russia able to sell its oil above the cap. In fact, practically no Russian oil, in fact, is being sold below the cap. Russia achieving economic growth this year, no sign of a contraction. They also admit that the Russian budget is in a stable situation. Some of you may remember that at the start of this year, lots of talk about the fact that the Russians were going to run a catastrophic budget problem this year. The people were talking about a budget crisis because the budget deficit in January was $25 billion. Well, I always said that that was nonsense. And so it turns out. And now the European Commission acknowledges that the federal budget deficit will exceed 2% in 2023 and stand roughly at 2% of GDP in 2024. They also say that they expect defense spending to soar to about 6% of GDP, constituting about 1/3 of the total budget. That may be correct, but then they go on to say, despite this, the budget is set to remain largely under control as the government has proved its ability to address revenue shortfalls through a range of windfall taxes, especially with energy companies. So no budget crisis. And by the way, I'm not even confident. I'm far from sure that they're even right about these longer range budget deficit projections either. That will depend on many factors, the growth in the domestic economy and the state of the oil price market. Nonetheless, in spite of all of that, the EU is now busy preparing its next round of sanctions. They're going to sanction Russian diamonds. I've discussed that in the past. They're now going to bring sanctions against Gazprom Bank. The United States is going to try to bring sanctions against Russia's liquefied natural gas industry, which, by the way, continues to supply natural gas to Europe, thereby intensifying the energy pressures within Europe itself. There is that famous expression that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is a sign of madness. Well, I don't know about whether the leaders of the West are mad, but it does seem as if they are doing the same thing again and again and again, still expecting at some point, somewhere along the line, a different result. Well, there we go. Now, I saw a report somewhere, I forget where now, that apparently EU officials are now busy telling each other that the war in Ukraine is going to last 5 years. Now, anybody who is following the situation close up, as I've been doing, I have to say, I think that is a fantasy. I don't expect the war in Ukraine to last for 5 years, but I can understand why Western officials want to tell each other that it will. And here I draw on my experience working on the fringes of government, both in Greece and Britain. When people give these numbers of 5 years, it's not because they really expect a war like this to go on for 5 years. It's because they want to put off a decision. They don't want to make a really important or serious or difficult decision, a decision that might cause for them political trouble, like in this case, picking up the telephone to Vladimir Putin and talking peace. What they say is, we don't need to do anything now because we've still got 5 years to go. And of course, quietly, deep inside the recesses of their own minds, they're also saying to themselves, well, let's hope that this goes on long enough, 5 years perhaps, so that by the time it all falls apart, we ourselves will be on our way. We will no longer be occupying the present positions that we are occupying. We will have other, perhaps more comfortable, remunerative positions which we can fall back on. It is another symptom, this comment, observation about a 5-year war, is another symptom of the political paralysis that we see across the West, even as articles like the one in Pais tell us that the situation is catastrophically deteriorating. So what is taking place elsewhere in the world? Well, Xi Jinping is meeting Biden today. I'm going to discuss that more fully in my next program. I would say that the Chinese media itself is saying that Xi Jinping's hand with respect to his meeting with Biden has been strengthened by the failure of Ukraine's offensive this summer. So there we go. But what about the situation in the Middle East? Well, as far as I can understand, fighting between various militia groups and US forces continues, but the fighting in Gaza itself has, at least at the moment, abated a little. Israeli forces seem to be principally concentrated around 3 hospitals, and I've noticed that the staff at the Al-Shifa hospital have apparently negotiated with the Israelis for the Israelis to enter at least part of the hospital area so that they can then conduct an inspection and confirm for themselves the fact that there are in fact no Hamas fighters there, that all the reports about some giant Hamas base located beneath this hospital, that all of those reports are untrue. Now, I have seen other reports, there's a private one, which I haven't been able to follow up, by the way, which I do notice, which say that there has been photographic evidence provided by Israel about the existence of tunnels beneath some of these hospitals and, bunker complexes and things of that kind. I need to study these pictures. And of course, the question is not whether there are bunker complexes beneath these hospitals, but what they are being used for, which would determine whether or not a war crime has been committed. But I did also read on the mood of Alabama. Bernhardt there obviously has been busy doing some research. An article which he unearthed from the Tablet Catholic magazine, I believe it's British based, from 2014, which perhaps explains all of these claims and reports about this giant bunker complex beneath the Al-Shifa hospital, because it contains a report, this report in the Tablet from 2014, about a giant bunker complex created as a major command post beneath the Al-Shifa hospital by the Israeli Defense Forces themselves at a time, presumably in the 1970s, when Israel itself was controlling Gaza. Israel, of course, withdrew in 2005. So perhaps the Israelis, knowing about the existence of these vast bunkers beneath this hospital, assume that Hamas is using them also. Let me repeat again. I find it difficult to understand why Hamas would do that, since, as far as I can see, concentrating your command staff in that way, in a bunker complex, where it can be sealed and attacked, is contrary to everything I've understood about how insurgent and guerrilla and indeed terrorist groups operate. As far as I know, they operate on a dispersed, decentralized basis as cells, and that is what I would expect Hamas to do. Anyway, the fighting continues. The political pressure on the United States and Israel also continue. I understand that there are now pressures now from Turkey upon the International Criminal Court to formally open an investigation and perhaps issue arrest warrants and those kind of things, and even conceivably indictments against Israel. We'll see whether that happens. But there is something I need to say, which I do urgently need to correct. I have, in many videos, said that Israel itself is not a party to the Rome Statute, and that there cannot be a referral to the International Criminal Court without a referral, therefore, from the Security Council, the UN Security Council, though I assumed that if the UN General Assembly made a referral, the ICC, having gone ultra vires in issuing an indictment and an arrest warrant against President Putin, that if they got a referral like that from the General Assembly, they would have to acknowledge it. Well, it seems that the ICC in this case does not need a referral from the Security Council or the General Assembly. It already has jurisdiction. I say that because it turns out that in 2015, Palestine, the Palestinian Authority, which does have legal capacity in this issue, in this matter, joined the Rome Statute and ratified it. So Gaza falls within the jurisdictional authority of the Palestine Authority. Palestine Authority claims that it represents all of Palestinian territory, and I think that is internationally recognized. And therefore, Gaza, where all of these operations are being conducted, is a territory covered by the Rome Statute. I understand that on that basis, the ICC has already made clear that it considers that it possesses jurisdiction over war crimes committed in Gaza. So a referral from the Security Council or the General Assembly is not needed. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that such an investigation, such an indictment, such as the issue of an arrest warrant is necessarily going to come, but it is an interesting thought and possibility. And I read this article in the Russian media, and it comes from Izvestia, Russian newspaper, and it acknowledged that there is no realistic prospect of the United Nations at any point in time finding Israel either at the level of the Security Council to be guilty of war crimes, because the United States would impose its veto. But then this article contains the following comment. Sergei Orjonikidze, former UN Under-Secretary General and ex-Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, believes that the United Nations could recognize Israel's war crimes in the General Assembly. Much will depend on Arab and Muslim nations. In particular, they could convene a special General Assembly session and put forward a resolution on the matter. They have a majority of the votes, and I think that many countries of the global south will support them. So even though the ICC doesn't need a referral from the General Assembly in order to act, because it already has jurisdiction, one ex-Russian official, presumably one well-connected ex-Russian official, appears to think that sooner or later, the General Assembly will make a referral nonetheless. Well, we shall see. Now, I'm just going to say one thing, one very last thing, which is about this particular Russian diplomat, Sergei Ordzhonikidze. The name Sergei Ordzhonikidze is a famous one in Soviet history. He was the commissar for heavy industry in Stalin's government. He's a major political figure following the Bolshevik Revolution. He was a very senior person in the Russian Bolshevik and Soviet Communist Party. Ordzhonikidze, the original one, in the 1930s, fell out with Stalin and apparently committed suicide because he disagreed with some of Stalin's policies in the 1930s. But he has always, the Ordzhonikidze name has always been associated, if you like, in the Soviet Union with what you might call communist aristocracy. I would be intrigued to know, is this particular person, this former diplomat, Sergei Ordzhonikidze, belongs to this family. I mentioned the other day how Michael Schulenberg, who co-authored that report in Germany about the failure of the peace talks in March last year, the peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, belongs to a famous diplomatic family. Perhaps Ordzhonikidze belongs to a famous family as well. Diplomacy is one of those careers which does tend to run in families, and here perhaps we see an example of that. Anyway, I end this program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X, as well as YouTube. And of course, you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And by going to our shop, you can find all sorts of great things there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day. Until then.